Welcome to Access Europe for the October session 2024. This is now our 32nd meeting, which is quite amazing how time has flown. And my co-host, Alessandro, we've finally persuaded him to show the code behind his drag and drop engine. So that's going to be the topic of today's session. But before we get over to Alessandro, I'm just going to drag onto here the news and events page from my website, because we now have, as of this month, 9 Access user group chapters, with 4 new ones having been started this year. So as well as the long-standing Lunchtime Europe, España, SQL Server and Pacific groups, we now have a Latino group from Mexico in Spanish, led by Edgar Olivares. Alessandro is starting his own chapter next week in Italian for all Access developers from Italy and Italian-speaking developers everywhere, but also welcome anyone else like me who can't speak Italian at all. There is an Australia group that meets in the middle of the night for us in Europe, led by Kent Gorrell, and then there's also what none of the current groups actually cater for, and that is the beginners group, specifically beginner level topics. And Juan Soto, who is the overall president of Access User Groups, is going to be starting that off. As with all the other groups, then the new groups will have their videos available on YouTube soon after each meeting. I also like to mention that later this month, on the 19th and 20th of October, there is an Access conference in Germany, in Nuremberg, a weekend conference, and you can get the details of that from the AEK website, and that I've put that in the chat there, www.doncol.com, AEK agenda.htm. And one more thing, in November, and I'll say more about this next month, it's not me that's actually organising this in any way at all, but the UK Access User Group has its own live conference on the 20th of November at Oxford University, and it's a one-day event. With that, then, I'm going to move that back out of the way. Remind you then, this month we have Alessandro Grimaldi, and I'm sure this is going to live up to the recent wonderful series of events that we've put on in the last few months here. And I've seen the material he's doing, and it's excellent. Alessandro, over to you, and please introduce yourself properly.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Colin, for having me here today. Yeah, let me briefly introduce myself. I started programming in 1982, and since 1998, my favorite working tool is VBA, especially Access. For some years, I consulted for a United Nations agency called WFP, the World Food Program, for which I worked in Afghanistan, in Pyongyang, North Korea, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and then Rome, Italy. I then worked in Austria for another UN agency, and since 2014, I've been living in Frankfurt, where I worked at the European Central Bank for 5 years, always as a VBA developer. As you probably know, at least those of you who know me, my favorite activity is designing graphical interfaces for Access, which is a bit weird, I know, because apparently not many Access developers seems to be interested in this same topic, which on the contrary, I find fascinating. When I first presented my works at DevCon 2021, I received a lot of positive feedback, but also several requests to disclose the code behind those interfaces. And in the following months, these requests kept coming in. So at first I published some tutorials on my website. I even hosted a few live workshops, but eventually I decided to write a book about it to explain the whole thing in full details. But then I started being asked if the book is worth the price, what's inside, if the full code is included. Yes, it is. What it is really about, and so on and so forth. So I would like to use this meeting today to partially reply to those requests, and at the same time take this chance to give you an overview of the drag and drop engine, which is the base of practically all the interfaces I showed in the past. First of all, I very quickly show you again some of the interfaces we're talking about, so even those of you who know nothing about my work can get an idea of what it is about. I chose the most important, the most relevant. For example, my absolute first attempt to create a graphical interface dating back to 2007 2006 when I was working for WFP in their headquarters in Rome. Vessel Loader was a prototype to manage ship loading operations, which had a large success in WFP Ethiopia when I first presented it. And its companion, Happy Birthday, a port manager to manage ship unloading operations, which features the most complete version of the scrolling timeline, whose basic form is discussed in the book. And finally, the sliding door effect, which I used in some presentations in the past, also detailed in the book. Then I'll sketch the code behind the basic technique, which is common to all these interfaces, the drag and drop. As I said, I won't show you the full detailed code, sorry, Colin, but for that you need to buy the book. But I'll give you enough information to replicate it by yourself if you want to, and if you have some time to spend on it. I'll sketch the basic form of the drag and drop, and I'll talk about a variation which is very useful when you deal with many instances of the same object with events. Finally, if we have time, I'll spend a couple of words on the new book I'm writing on an easier and more restricted topic, which is sliders, because sliders are often used, or better, are often needed in many applications, but Access doesn't have a proper native slider control. So knowing how to build one may come in handy. And if we still have a couple of minutes, I'll show you the application I'm currently working on, Ribbonizer, which is a ribbon builder. So this is the book we're talking about, Advanced Interactive Interfaces with Access, which is published by APress, an American publisher of the Springer network. It's currently being processed, so it should be available in the next weeks, hopefully in the next days. This book was formerly known as Access on Steroids, but APress, for some reason, they didn't like the name, so they changed it, but the content is absolutely the same. I have to admit that the original title was somehow misunderstandable. A few weeks after I had released it online, my PayPal account was blocked because they thought that I was selling illegal substances, and they asked me to submit my medical license before unlocking my account. On a second thought, Access on Steroids is clearly misunderstandable. I take this chance to thank Colin and Simone Bardi once again for accepting being the technical reviewers of the book, so you'll also find their names in it. Anyway, so as you may know, years ago, I had this strange idea of creating graphical interfaces, or dynamic interfaces, as I prefer to call them, with Access. AIDA is the first dynamic interface I ever created with the help of my good friend Simone Bardi. It was 2006, and WFP needed a centralized database to track a huge amount of information about the food they were distributing all over the world. Our task was to design an Access database including every possible piece of information and compatible with the different local realities of the 82 countries involved in their projects. This was a prototype, so the interface was a bit raw, not very elegant, but it shows location, objectives, activities, beneficiaries, commodities with figures and totals. So a large amount of information, which in a standard interface will probably be scattered through several forms, while here is presented on one single screen. The operational chains are also visible and selectable. For example, if I click on this commodity here, I can see where, why, to whom, and how much of this food was distributed just with a single click. And I can double click on any box and I can expand the information and get the details, and I can change the details. As you can see, some dimensions are very complicated because they hold a lot of information. New chains can be created graphically. For example, I can add a new group of beneficiaries. Now let me add some random numbers here. Okay, and I can connect this group of beneficiaries to commodities, because that's what I'm distributing them, and to existing chains. So I created a new operational chains, two new operational chains, and all the figures are immediately updated. Data can also be aggregated on multiple fields. For example, I can aggregate beneficiaries on category and commodities by name to get the aggregated figures about where, why, what, to whom, and how much with aggregated totals. So there's a ton of other features accessible from this single screen, but that would take too long. The thing that really got me into this kind of stuff was the possibility to show a huge amount of information basically on one single screen, something that I found really intriguing and pushed me to explore deeper along this road. How is it done? Well, nothing special, as I said at DevCon 2021 when I showed this application for the first time. Just labels and lines put on the form at design time, nothing else. Of course, some code. But this was well before I discovered classes. If we look at the code, as you can see, I had to repeat the same code over and over for every active object. And in this case, there are almost 300 labels. So the resulting code is absolutely unbearable. As I said, the interface is rather slow and not extremely sexy, but I'm very fond of it for historical and sentimental reasons, since it laid down the foundation of my work for the following 20 years. The second application I'll show you is an evolution of that first interface, even though it looks rather different. The logistics problem here was to load the food coming from donors onto ships that would deliver it in Ethiopia. There are objects that can be connected by lines, like in AIDA, graphically and quickly, like just clicking with a few clicks. But the drag and drop concept was introduced. I can drag the object here and move them around the screen. Here as well, if you look at the code, it's just at the form, it's just a matter of some labels, text boxes and images put on the form, and of course lines at design time. And if you look at the code, we are in the same situation I mentioned before. A large amount of objects, each of which runs basically the same code. In this case, each object responds to 3 events, so the code lines are multiplied by 3, which is totally insane. The complementary application to VeLo was Happy Birthday, whose purpose was to manage the arrival of the ships, of those ships, in the 3 ports of Djibouti, Berbera, and Port Sudan. And this is a good example of how complex things can get. It's a complex interface, even worse, because besides the usual draggable objects, which represents the ships, there are many additional static objects which nonetheless share the same code. For example, the scrolling arrows, the berth labels, or the port labels, and the timelines interact with each other as they can scroll together, like in this moment, or I can decide to scroll them separately, these and this. With shared or individual settings, I can decide to scroll this one by 1 day at a time, and this one can scroll, for example, 1 month at a time, and so on. This was another prototype, so I could limit the number of dynamic objects to, half a dozen. But in a real case scenario, there could be several dozens of sub-objects. So again, we have a huge unmanageable code. The sliding doors effect is a more recent product, which shows another variation of the drag and drop. Initially, I thought it would be easier since the movement is restricted to the horizontal axis. There's no vertical movement, but it turned out to be harder, really. That's because in a normal drag and drop, the movement is only limited by the form boundaries, and all the objects are usually independent from one another. While here, the movement may also be limited by the previous and the next handle if either exist. So these objects are not independent. And this had a relevant impact on the original code. I had to find a brand new approach, and eventually I designed a two-level class hierarchy I call the master-slave technique. The details would take a session on their own, but I'll sketch the structure in a moment. So these are all examples of what I call dynamic interfaces. As I said, the basic technique behind these interfaces is the drag and drop of objects, mainly images, but also other controls such as command buttons or labels. This technique can be useful in many situations, and it's rather flexible so that it can be modified to fit the specific needs, as we saw with the ships and the sliding doors. The basic code structure I use here is the class. These things cannot be properly made without a class, or better, some of the applications I just showed prove that you can do something complex even without classes. But we saw how the code quickly explodes and gets totally unmanageable. Now, I'm aware that many of you rarely or never use classes, and maybe some of you don't even know how to build one. And that's perfectly fine as long as you don't need them. But especially when you have to handle a lot of objects of the same type, like I have to do in these applications, classes become an unreplaceable and priceless tool that makes the whole thing possible, not to mention the huge benefits a class can offer in terms of speed of development, maintainability, and code reusability. So how does it work? It's not rocket science. It's extremely simple, and I remember it took me a couple of hours to figure out. The final code is about 20 lines or so, including comments. If you think about it, it's very logical. Dragging an object involves three events: mouse down, executed when the user clicks the mouse on the control to grab it; mouse move, when the object has been grabbed and the user moves the mouse; and mouse up, which stops the dragging movement. So it's very, very simple. So let's create a class. Let's call it class drag. The class obviously needs to know which control to move. In this example, we will use an image, the number one we saw a moment ago, that will be stored in an internal variable. Let's call it my image as image. It's with events, of course, because it needs to react to the three events I just mentioned. So the mouse down, no, we don't need the click event in this case. Mouse down means that the dragging starts. So we need to enable mouse move using, for example, a Boolean variable with what is normally called the traffic light. So if the user moves the mouse without clicking on the object, nothing happens. In the mouse up event, mouse up does the opposite. So the dragging stops. We have to disable mouse move, meaning that the variable, the traffic light, is reset, probably to false. So the next mouse movements will be ignored. And everything actually happens in the mouse move. That's what it does. If the traffic light is green, so if the variable is true, if the image has been grabbed by the user and it's being moved around, then we need to calculate the mouse movement to check how much the mouse has been moved since the moment it grabbed the image. And then we have to move my image to follow the mouse to the mouse position. And this is it. The most difficult step is calculating the mouse movement. But as I said, it took me very little to figure it out. So I guess it must not be that complicated. And this is all it takes for the drag and drop to happen. We also need a public method, obviously, to receive the variables we need. Let's call it init, for example. And let's just pass the image here. But of course, there may be more parameters needed depending on the situation. This is it. So once the class is done, how do we use it? Well, in the form, we declare and create an instance of the class. So we declare it, object as class drag. And in the form load, we create the object. new class drag, and pass the image that I called image drag1. Okay, and that's all. I mean, from this moment, from the image you pass it with a simple line like this, immediately becomes draggable. If you have a second image, well, it's very easy. We can just duplicate the code. Object 2, image drag 2, provided that you obviously name the image properly. And now you have two independent draggable images. As you can see, it's really simple, and it just takes a handful of lines of code. I repeat, all this stuff here, which is the most, the core of the drag and drop engine, is just maybe 10, 12 lines, no more than that. If you have many objects, replicating the code may not be the best solution. In this case, you can pack them in an array, something like, let's say, nine objects. If the images are properly named, for example, again, image drag 1, image drag 1, image drag 2, 3, 4, and so on, these lines can be replaced by a simple loop. So as integer for E1 to 9, set object I new class drag and object I init controls image drag I. Okay, obviously nothing changes in the class because that's how class should work. But this is just the basics. Problems arise if you need your objects to generate events, which is quite common. For example, it's rather normal that when an object is dropped, the main form has to perform some actions to react to the event. And this complicates the whole thing because we should define an event in the class. Let's say public event, let's call it dropped, raised when the image is dropped. So in the mouse up event here, so raise event dropped. Okay, and the array should become with events. But as you can see, we can't do that because VBA doesn't allow arrays objects with events. It's not possible. But we do need an array because the only alternative is declaring one variable for each image. And we saw earlier what consequences this choice would have in terms of code replication and maintenance. Now, there are several possible solutions, but the one I prefer and the one I normally use is something I already mentioned earlier, the master-slave technique, which requires two classes. It might seem a bit complicated at first, but I think it's great in terms of flexibility and scalability. The price to pay is a slight complication of the code while writing the classes. Discussing the details would take too long, of course, so I will just give you some hints about the overall structure. And this is the structure. We need two classes called master and slave. The slave is what we have called class drag so far, and its role will still be making an image draggable, but it will report to class master, not to the form. The form will talk to an instance of class master, which is seen as a single object, so it can raise events if needed. And class master will act as an intermediary between the form and class slave, handling the array of images on behalf of the form, practically hiding this implementation detail from the form. The form will never know anything about the existence of an array. It will only see one single object, class master, all the time. So let's change this class name to class slave for consistency. Okay. And create class master. As we said, class master can raise events if needed. So let's cut the event we created in class slave and paste it in class master. We also add an image as a parameter so that the calling form will know which image has been moved. Now, the form, we said, sees a single instance of the class. So this will be So the form sees a single instance, and we can define it as with events. The form will pass all the images to this class, probably again in the load event. So this is going to be a bit different. Set obj equals new class master. Okay. For I1 to 9, we don't need these. Object add. So class master through the public method add will store them in an internal array class slave. So class master will manage the array of objects, and the form will never need to know anything about this array. The add method we need will be something like add an image. But this is very standard as integer bound +1 redeem preserve images. I set images plus slave images I init image for now. What happens here? We create a new slot in the internal array, and this will be an image of type class slave. We then pass the image down to class slave, just like the form used to do before, and this means the image is now draggable. Now, when this master-slave technique is used, it's always very useful to pass the slave class also the index of the object in the main array, which is I in this case. And there is a third parameter we need, and it's a pointer to this master class. So we use the reserved word me. And this is a crucial point. We will see why in a moment. Of course, there may be more parameters, whatever we need, but these are the main three. So let's update the init method. We need index as integer, and let's say caller as class master. Of course, this will be stored in local variables, private my index as integer, and let's call private my caller as class master. So my index is index and set my caller to caller. The trick here is that class slave raises no event. When something interesting happens, for example, when the image is dropped, the class calls a public method in class master using this pointer, passing its position to the array. So something like my caller, let's imagine there's a method called dropped, which we can call passing the index that this image has in class master's array. So class master at this point can do something with the image. Public sub dropped. It receives an index and can do something with the images index. But most of all, it can pass the information to the highest level, that is the form, raising an event. Raise event dropped, also passing the image that generated the event. Remember that the form knows nothing about the array, so passing the index itself wouldn't have much sense. That's why we pass the corresponding image, which is something the form knows and understands. So let's recap. Class master receives images from the form, stores them in an array, and makes them draggable, simply passing them to an instance of class slave, which handles all the events. Also passing a pointer to itself. It basically tells each image, go with a slave. In case you need it, this is how you can call me. And don't forget to tell me who you are. So each class slave instance receives the image and manages the drag and drop. When the move is finished, when the image is dropped, it calls the master saying, hey, I am image number, my index, and I've been moved. The master receives the message, does what it has to do, and then passes it on to the form, saying this image has been moved. And this closes the loop. From the form point of view, the code is very simple. We created the object and passed it the images, and that's all we need to do. From this moment on, class master and class slave will be in charge of managing movements and events. All we still have to do here is to react to the event. In this case, only one. So we can do something with image. And it's done. The good thing is that at this point, we can create all the draggable images we want, simply changing this number here and nothing else. I know it may not be easy to fully understand it at first, but once the classes have been built, their use is extremely simple. The key point is that class slave manages only one image, while class master is aware of all images and the form only talks to class master as a single object. So the real purpose of class master is to hide the details of the implementation from the form, so that the form does not have to declare and manage the array of images, which of course depend on the specific application you're building, so that the code here can vary significantly. And this means that this structure is very generic, scalable. These two classes can be imported with no modifications in any other project. The form code will always be this simple, regardless of the number of images. Of course, many variations are possible. For example, in my VeLo applications, each ship is actually made of two images, the ship and the flag, plus two text boxes with the ship name and other information. So these four objects must be managed and moved by class slave as a group. So here, there's not only the image, but also the other three controls, but the concept is the same. I would have liked to show you also how to connect two images with a line, but I couldn't find a quick and easy way to do that. But that's another thing you can find in the book. Well, that's it. I hope you're not too disappointed I didn't show too much of the code. I know. I hope it wasn't too hard or too boring to follow anyway, in which case Colin would have been right in wanting a less technical presentation. If there's any question, I'd be glad to take it.
Thank you, Alessandro. That was wonderful. I love the way you built up the use of classes, and comments in the chat from other people indicate the fact that also people like the way it developed there. There were not many questions, but I'll come on to them in a second there. There were lots of non-PC jokes about access, steroids, masters and slaves, and so on. Being as Access is PC only, I dare not read out aloud in the context of this meeting. Anyway, right, we'll come back to the question. I'll do them in chronological order. And the first question was from Ben Sakarik, who asked whether the code would work in an ACCDE file, because there seems to be changes in design view and so on. Something you can comment on?
Yes, it does. I mean, you explicitly, pass the objects to the class, so I don't see any problem. The objects are there on the form, even in an ACCDE. I don't see any problem.
Have you tested it on an ACCDE?
No.
It's only when you save them, I think, Ben, that you would, or try to save them, that you might have a problem with an ACCDE. I think Crystal replied earlier in the text to that effect. That's my expectation too, if that helps.
So you're not creating any controls on the fly?
No.
They already exist.
They are already there at design time.
I know that's a situation where you have to be in an MDB.
No,
Sorry, I didn't understand that, Ben. Sorry. All the controls are on the form. That's why you've got these mass ranks of ships and cargo and so on sitting there hiding. They're all there. They're just being used as needed. So I don't see there's a problem either, but I thought I'd ask.
No, I don't think there's a problem. I tried years ago. I tried to create objects on the fly using, create control and stuff like that. But the problem is that you have to somehow link some code to these objects, and this had a nasty side effect. When I created code on the fly, Access forgot all the global variables, and there was a big problem. So I was crazy at the time. I was very young, so I created a routine that saved on a text file all the current values of all the globals variable, created the form with the objects and the code, and then reload all the values, like a snapshot of the global variables. I will never do that again.
Although I can understand why you'll never do it again. Would it have worked if you'd used temp vars instead of global variables? Because then they wouldn't have lost their value.
I'm talking about 20 years ago. I didn't know about them very
They didn't exist 20 years ago, no. Right, okay.
Maybe, I don't know.
I'll move us on to the next question, which was from Tim Finch, talking about your master-slave class arrays. He wondered whether you could use a collection for that purpose.
Instead of an array, yes, as long as assigning a instance of a class to a collection element doesn't harm, doesn't create any problem. I prefer,
Okay.
you can use a dictionary as well. I prefer, in this case, I prefer an array because it has an index, and the index is an easy way to determine which image has been moved. With a collection, maybe it's not so easy.
Okay, Tim, did you want to add anything to that?
That's a no from Tim. Can I just add, the only thing that with a collection is it's the same as an array, you can't do with events. So.
Sorry, say it again?
Well, if you had a collection of objects, you couldn't have with events for those objects. You'd still have to treat it with the same master-slave approach.
Yeah, probably.
Okay, I will
so,
just pop in, if I may.
Who's that speaking at the moment?
It's Tim.
Okay.
The only suggestion I was asking was, simply switching out the array for a collection. You'd still need the master-slave approach that you've eloquently explained to us. So it was only just I thought a collection would be, it just somehow fits nicer with classes and objects than an array does. But, it works. The question really was, had you tried collections and then hit a brick wall so that you had to switch to arrays? But it possibly just sounds like you started with an array, you've made it work, and therefore not tried collections.
No, I prefer simple solutions. I work very comfortable with arrays, so
yeah. Thank you.
I have no problem with it.
Moving on, a question from Ant. How do you deal with drags that are abandoned, or if you move off the form or the host control?
No, there's of course some checks.
Yeah.
You calculate mouse movement, you calculate the new position, but also check if the position if the new position is allowed. So if it's within the allowed area, for example, I can show you here. Oh, okay. For example, let me show you. In this case, these objects are bound to the land, so I cannot move. I check the new coordinate when I move them, and I make sure that they don't cross the border of the land and go onto the sea. So there are, of course, checks you can do before moving the object to make sure they stay in the allowed area.
Okay, thank you. Neil asked, how does the form know about the data associated with the dropped image?
The data associated with dropped image. Yeah, that's a very good question. Okay. This is a very simple structure. Just we are in class slave now. So the object, the image. But of course, here you can store all the properties you want about this image. I usually create a UDT, so something like private type, locals, and I put everything I need to put here. And I store everything I need to store here. So, I mean, this is a class. This is a big container, and you can add anything you like. That's one great possibility that classes give you.
So what I was going to say was you drop the image, whereas if you actually drop the class, then the form can get to all the class's properties, whereas dropping the image, all it's going to get is the image. You use the class as the parameter in the drop event rather than the image. Is that what you're saying?
Are you talking about these?
In your example, on the form, what was dropped by the master thing was an image, whereas really I think it needs to be a slave class object so that you can get to the object, all its properties, its image, and all the other things that you've just pertained to.
Yes, of course. If you need to access more methods and properties of the class, you can pass a reference to the class if you want.
Yeah,
in this case, in the drag and drop case, you just need the image usually, but of course you can modify whatever you want and
if you drop me, which is the instance of the slave class, then the form can get to every property of the slave class.
Sure, if you need.
Yeah.
It's a very flexible structure, actually. You can do all the changes you need. It's not carved in stone.
Neil had another question. Does the mouse move miss events if the mouse moves quickly?
sometimes, but you have to be really quick. I mean, modern computers are very, very, very fast. I mean, it's not a time-consuming code. Again, this is the core, and it's just a few lines, a couple of sums, and a couple of if, and that's it. So it's extremely quick. You have to move now extremely quick to make it miss a bit.
I think the reason I ask that is because sometimes, for example, if you put a mouse move event in the detail of a form and you move your control, you move your mouse from one control to the other, it doesn't fire as it goes over the detail. Sometimes Access just doesn't fire the mouse move event because the mouse has moved on by
That's true.
Access got around to it. Has that ever caused you problems in your drag and drop is what I meant?
No, the mouse move is executed only when you have the mouse button down, because you are moving the object. You grab the object and move it. If you have your finger down, you can't move the mouse so quickly that Access can't follow it. And if you do, well, it's a problem. I mean, you're doing something extremely strange after all, because there's no need to move the mouse like this. But as you see, there's no problem.
Okay, thank you.
Also, because it might miss a beat every now and then, but the very next moment it catches up. Yeah, it recovers immediately, so you don't even see it.
Okay.
May I ask on that, Alessandro? Does that mean that the information you get, the parameters you get when the mouse move, it will tell you the X and Y isn't relative to the last position, but relative to the first position? Or exactly what parameters do you get? I'm curious on that.
You want the details?
just
I can tell you that.
Not great detail. Just
I can tell you that
relative to.
Okay, I can tell you that on the mouse move, you see there's a. No, where is that? Sorry, I lost. Okay, here the mouse move, you have X and Y.
Yes.
The system parameters. These X and Y are relative to the object you are moving. So not to the screen, not relative to the screen, not relative to the form, but they are relative to the top left of the image you are moving. So if you freeze the starting position, from this X you can infer the amount of the horizontal movement.
I get that it's complicated, but I'm not after the complication. Is it the X? Is it relative to the top left position of the last time it called my mouse move, or is it relative to the top left position? Oh, I suppose it's last time you moved it. It's always going to be relative.
No,
where it was.
No, this is actually the current position. Okay, this is the current position of the image you're moving.
But
so this minus the starting point gives you the distance traveled, the image traveled.
Indeed. So what I'm trying to say here is that that's essentially relative to the last time the image was painted. Because if you miss a mouse move event, you don't paint, you don't move that image.
I see what you mean.
But
yes, but
the next one gets.
But yeah, but it's not a problem. Again, it doesn't really. I never had the problem with these things. The thing is this thing minus the starting point gives you the distance traveled by the image. That's it. By the mouse.
And that's perfect, because that means that when you miss a mouse move, it won't adversely impact next time you run this code.
No, absolutely.
Right. Alessandro, I'm hoping to get you to go back to give us a brief preview of some of the other things you mentioned. And I've asked if anyone else has got any questions to raise their hands before we get to that. There's one quick question, but I think you've sort of covered this from Chris Kleiner. On the mouse down, do you record the image position?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
I told you everything.
Yeah.
There's nothing else. I told you everything about the drag and drop.
Right. You can now all go off and do this. And in 10 minutes time, you'll have a complete working database, all of you. And obviously they can refer to the video and see how it's built up and so on. And they can buy your book, which is an excellent.
They must.
It is an excellent purchase. I really recommend this. Tim Finch, you have your hand up, you good boy. You did what you were asked.
Thanks very much, Colin. I should have done that earlier. I do apologise. It's fascinating just listening, Alessandro, to how you're doing this. because I've worked quite a bit with Aleksander's code from the Gantt chart presentations, particularly when he did the first one.
Oh my God.
And of course, he's using the GDI to draw everything. So he's actually not using access controls. He's using an image control, but basically as a canvas and drawing it all. But of course, what he went on to do, and actually, ironically, I had also had a go at this myself prior to his most recent presentation, was to class all of the blocks in his lanes, you know, on his Gantt chart. And so watching you talk this through is very interesting, because quite a few of the same issues, you know, how to keep a collection of, you know, references to each of the blocks, and that's where I used a collection, and these idea of tracking the mouse down, move and ups, and making sure that things only dragged. So it's really interesting, the overlap between the two approaches, and of course they're fundamentally different in how it all gets painted on screen, but interesting that the issues are so. It's really more a comment than a question. Thank you.
Thanks. So I actually don't think there are too many points of contact between the Gantt chart and, say, for example, the timeline. There are very different stuff. I don't even use API here, just pure VBA 100%. This is a label, this is a text box, and there's only VBA code. So this is extremely simple compared to the GDI, to the Gantt chart that Aleksander's made. Actually, my idea was to modify this timeline to realize to create a Gantt chart without all that API structure, which is extremely complicated.
It took me a long time to get my head around what he was doing when I've looked at his original code, but I kind of felt like
I tried to. I took a quick peek at the code and I quit.
Well, that's why I thought I'm going to try and class this, and of course that forced me to learn more about, you know, how do you use the API calls and so forth. And it's clearly a steeper learning curve, but it is interesting, you know, you've both approached a drag and drop style requirement from just completely different approaches. It's been really, really interesting, especially your use of master and slave class.
Completely different.
Right. Can you go? Sorry, Alessandro.
Consider, sorry, Colin. Consider that I could explain how this timeline is built in a few pages of the book. I'm not sure that Gantt chart can be described easily in a book in written words.
Okay, go back and tell us about the other things that you mentioned right at the beginning. We'll make sure you've got enough time to do that briefly.
I guess you're not interested in a book, so I will show you the Ribbonizer, which is more interesting, I guess. This is my last project on which I've been working for the last months. I know there's plenty of ribbon builders out there, but I don't really like any of them, so I decided to build my own. It obviously implements the drag and drop we just discussed, as I can't make anything without it anymore. So when you click on the node, the right part here, the right side, changes to show most, if not all, of the available properties for that kind of control. In this moment, the ribbon contains only a default button, but on the left here, you have all the available ribbon components. So new nodes can be created just by dragging and dropping these items onto the tree view. And nodes can also be moved around to rearrange the ribbon. Let's put the checkbox here so you can, there's a lot of flickering, but I'll try to reduce it. Button. But I think the most relevant feature here is the real life preview of the button that you have here on the top, which is updated as you make your changes. For example, if I change this button label and I call it, I don't know, my first button, this change is immediately reflected in the upper ribbon. The same with visibility. For example, I can hide it and show it. I can even add images. In this case, there's the default image, but you see it's already there. I can also select a different image, a custom image. I have these flags here I always use as a test. Okay, and here it is. I can change the size. Let's see how it works. As you can see, it's a real-time update. And so on. Some components like combos, for example, use items, and they can be either static or dynamic. So I can add static item from here, static items from here, 132, 132. But there's also the possibility to switch to dynamic items 1, 2, 3. But as you know, the number of dynamic items is decided by this function here, get item count, and you can select a test value, for example, 5. So now you have 5 dynamic items, or you can switch back to the 3 static items, to starting static items. Operations can be performed on single nodes, like, for example, changing them to something else in place. For example, I can change this to a checkbox. The new control inherits every possible properties from the original button. For example, we have the same label, screen tip, super tip. They should be available. They're not. Super tip, screen tip. Yeah, okay, they're there. And you can edit them, whatever.
Alessandro, can you remind me the difference between a screen tip and a super tip in a ribbon? I've forgotten.
Yeah, the bold upper writing is a screen tip and the bottom is a super tip.
Okay, thank you. A bit like a formatted message box then, really. Okay.
Yeah, it is. I didn't do anything. It's just a system.
Yeah, I know it's built in. Yeah.
Behavior. Yeah, it's built in. And what else? Well, you can export XML for a single branch if you want. So if you have a branch you want to copy and paste somewhere else in another XML you're editing, you can do that without the need to recreate it from scratch. And you can also export the whole XML file for the whole ribbon. It's a formatted XML. And another interesting feature is that it can generate, for example, let's say this is another button, so we can share some code. For example, let's say I have a get screen tip. So this needs a callback function, in this case called screen tip. Let's say the same for button 2, and I have other callback functions like get size and whatever. When I create the XML, I also create the code with the proper callbacks with already the selected case with involved controls. So it's easy to edit it and do whatever you want, return each value you want. This code can be, or the XML can be copied to a clipboard and paste it somewhere else. It will be possible to inject the XML and the code directly in an existing Access file. I haven't done it yet, but I will. And what else? Well, there's a ribbon manager, because ribbons can be saved, so you can browse the saved ribbons. You have a quick preview to see what it is, and you decide, okay, I want this one. Okay, load this one, and you can continue editing or export or do whatever you want. There's much more to it, more functionalities, but it's not completed yet. There are still several issues I have to solve, but I'm confident that it can be at least 90% ready for the next DevCon in April 25. So I asked Carl Donnerbauer if I can have a slot to discuss it in details. And that's really it. If you have any question.
Brilliant. Thank you. There were 2 questions, Alessandro. One, because you can export the XML, you can run that, you'll be able to import it into Excel or indeed any other Office app that
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if Access Ribbon works in a 100% compatible with Excel. I'm not sure.
I believe it should do. I mean, there may be odd little sections that won't do, but I know the one that I'm used to, Gunter Avenius, his one you can actually use with Excel and PowerPoint. So I think you would find it would do. And a question from Alex Kidd. Is this going to be a standalone app or will it run as an add-in from Access?
Standalone for now.
Okay.
Then we'll see.
Right, that was excellent. Thank you ever so much. And several people have thanked you and asked me to pass on just how impressed they are with this. And again, thank you from all of us for that wonderful piece of work. And as I say, I have the luxury of having reviewed the ebook. I have a copy of it, and it is certainly excellent. And it's available now via Alessandro's website. And there's also so this Ribbonizer will be available sometime soon. There's a slider you were also working on. Was that the little toggle switch that you showed us earlier, or was it a proper slider control?
You mean this one?
Yeah, that's the toggle switch.
It's a That's that's one of that's the first toggle described in my new in my new book.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Oh,
But
no,
that's so easy. I mean, so simple.
I know. I've got I have my own version of that as well. So but
yeah,
it's
sure.
so,
Everybody has.
but it's so effective. It should be a standard access control. It's ludicrous. Right.
Should
Okay.
be. I agree.
Right. And
to
lovely.
find
And
the shop and the book, everything. Yeah.
And there's lots and lots of other excellent things on the website as well. Right. Thank you ever so much. I am going to now ask you to stop sharing, and I am going to take back over again. Thank you. Chris was our very first presenter back in 2022 after the inaugural meeting, and we've got him back again, and he's going to be talking about his image cataloguer. Unfortunately, Adrian has just gone to say Chris and I discussed how to spell cataloguer, and we ended up with the English version of the word with the U in it. So this is again, it's got drag and drop in it, an image photo cataloguer in Access, which Chris uses a lot because he keeps going on holiday, as you can see from the picture on the screen there. Right, Chris, I will stop sharing and over to you to tell us about next month.
Okay, can everybody see that? It's
yes,
fairly blank screen at the moment. Yeah, so what I've got thousands of photographs, and I thought it was about time I started to catalog them in some way so I could find things more easily. And this is my attempt at trying to do that. It works on a folder by folder basis. Basically, if I select a folder, you're not going to see any holiday pics, I'm afraid. If this populates a web control, not images, it just makes it a lot easier. You don't get the flickering and so on and so forth. Select this one, you can see what happens. It's mainly looking at the review column. It's slow, it's clunky, and as you move things around, it flickers away. Horrible. So I've moved it into web control, which makes it a lot easier. And the idea is this is a ADO controlled tree control, and you can tick what you want it to apply to. So this is to do with the renovation, and I could probably put more into there and say it's to do with groundworks as well. So if I look at that one, and then I can just move it to here, and it moves it into there, and it picks up the headings for renovation groundwork. So later on, when I want to look at all the pictures about groundworks, I can just call up groundworks. At the same time, it'll also pick up anything on house, and then something like holidays, for example. There we go. Crete. If I was to assign something to a villa there, it'll also assign it to Crete and holidays abroad. If I don't want the picture, then I can drag and drop it over here. And if I want to look at it in a bit more detail, then I can put it there. So that's basically how it works. Am I getting too much detail? Yeah.
I was going to say, I think there's a danger you're doing all of next month's presentation. And right, so okay. I would suggest that we've seen the outline of what it does. Next month, tell us in detail how it works.
Yeah, okay.
Right, thank you ever so much, Chris. So that's next month's presentation on Wednesday, the 6th of November. Thank you to Chris. Thank you again to Alessandro. And please do have a look into his book and the various different applications that he's got. They really are incredibly impressive. Right.
Thanks.
Okay. We will see you all next month.